We are back, and so is basketball. Say hello to DraftKings contributors Garion Thorne, Matt Meiselman, along with RotoWire's Nick Whalen. Fellas, very, very simple stuff here. We want your favorite DFS and Sportsbook plays on tonight's 7-game NBA slate.
All right, Nikola Jokic highlights the slate going up against Sacramento. He's going to cost you almost $2K more than the next available player. So, Garion, when you're looking at all these high-priced dudes here, like, who are you most confident in paying up for?
I mean, you can never go wrong with Jokic. I think we talked a lot about Devin Booker in the first segment. I think tonight is going to be one of the final nights for a while. You see him below 9K, so there's a buying window there. I also like Trae Young a lot. I mean, this is a game against the Bulls where we kept waiting and waiting and waiting, not only for, the Bulls' major offensive pieces with defensive question marks, but, losing Alex Caruso, losing Ball. How long would it take for us to see the defensive slippage? And it has definitely happened across the last 15 games. They're giving up over 116 points per 100 possessions in that span of time. They are also allowing the most opponent assists per 36 minutes of any Eastern Conference team within that span of time. It just seems like the perfect environment for someone like Trae Young, who's gone over 50 DraftKings points in 6 of his last 9 games. So there's a lot of very viable options up above 9K and even slightly below 9K if you want to include Booker, but I think Trae Young might actually be my favorite.
All right, who are you looking at, Matt?
Looking at Jokic, but I really don't think you can go wrong with any of these guys. I mean, Devin Booker for sure is the most underpriced. He's basically 8,800 for him kind of makes sense if Chris Paul were playing. Without Paul, like we talked about before, Booker's going to just have to do more for the offense. His assists are going to go up. His shot attempts probably go up. I think his efficiency probably drops a bit, but overall fantasy production has to go up for Booker. So if you can afford Jokic, I think it's Jokic, but my favorite guy in this range, I think, just has to be Booker. Yes, he's going to be chalk, so if you want to pivot to someone like Trae Young, I do think that's a good call. But I think the pricing is low enough on Booker to the point where you just say, this is the chalk that I'm going to play. I'll make a different choice elsewhere.
All right, Nick, who do you like paying up for?
Yeah, Booker's my guy, 8,800. But like Matt said, ownership's going to be high. I think everybody kind of knows what to expect, which we touched on the last NBA segment. I mean, DeMar DeRozan, the price is way up there at this point, $10,700. But last 8 games before the break, he was at 37.6 points, 5.6 rebounds, 5.8 assists, and 58% from the field. The usage rate, sky high. Players, when they get on a streak like that, he's got 8 straight games of at least 30 points. You tend to try to ride it out, see how long you could go. So I think he's going to come out firing on the other side of the break here. The Bulls do get Levine back. However, that worries me a little bit. But I think I'm still going to have some exposure to DeRozan in at least a few lineups. Jared Allen, not exactly somebody you're paying up for, but 7,600 for a guy who, the Cavs are not going to have their top 2 scoring guards in Garland and LeVert tonight. So I think 7,600 is a really good price for him as a building block. And then even Jason Tatum at 9,700, I do worry about blowout potential. And last time the Celtics played the Nets, I believe they got out to a 28-2 start in that game. This version of the Nets should be a little more competent, but might not be a night where Jason Tatum is playing 39 minutes.
All righty. From the high-priced guys to someone who will help you save some dough. Matt, who is your favorite value play on this slate?
I really don't want to pick Rajon Rondo, so I'm just going to go somewhere else. I just don't.
Well, is he on a national game? Is it a nationally televised game? He's a different guy on that
like
stage.
Abs-
Okay. Yeah, then I would.
Pistons. I don't.
Yeah,
think
I would fade him. I'd fade him.
Yeah, let's fade him. So I'll pick somebody else. I'll go with another veteran, though, and James Johnson. Johnson didn't start the last time the Nets played the Celtics, actually, but he came off the bench and was basically the Nets' best player in that game. He was the primary ball handler off the bench. And my hunch is that the Nets saw how that worked, and either one will go back to that again, just the same setup where they let Johnson be the second unit guy, or 2, they just move him into the starting lineup for this game and go off that strong production that he's had and just try to get him out there, and maybe they can get a different outcome against Boston early in the game, because the Nets were down 26 points before Johnson even stepped on the court, which is just a whole other thing. Just an insane game that one was. So if the Nets are going to have a different level of success here, maybe they decide that it's going to be because Johnson plays more. But this is still a very shorthanded team. He's only $3,500, so you don't really need a lot here to sell him. A lot of these Nets guys will look like pretty good values, especially the cheaper ones. So I think James Johnson's a good call, but there are a bunch of players on this slate in the 3 to 4K range that are worth considering. So I just think he might be a little more under the radar than someone like Rondo or Trendon Watford on the Blazers or a couple other guys.
All right, Nick, who are you considering then? Because Matt says there's a bunch of guys in that 3 to 4K range.
There sure are. The Nets kind of scare me a little bit just because, so many guys have been banged up and injured, over the last few weeks that I feel like we don't still have a great grasp on who's actually in the rotation night to night. So I think that's a stay away for me. Maybe I'll get burned there, but I'm happy to go with Rondo. I know it's not national TV. I know it's Cleveland, Detroit, like one of the most historically unappealing matchups of the last 15 years, but you're getting Rondo at $3,900. He has 2 40-plus DraftKings points games in the Cavs' handful of games before the break when Darius Garland was missing time with that lower back. Now we have no Garland and no LeVert. So Rondo's viable. I think Jetty Osman at 4,000, also very much viable. And then I'm also turning my attention to the Portland Trailblazers, who in the first segment, Garion noted I don't know what Yusuf Nurkic was doing over the All-Star break where he apparently tore plantar fascia in his foot. I think that is a completely illegitimate injury. They really have no depth at center. They don't have another true center on the roster right now. I think at some point they'll either bring in a 10-day or call someone up from the G League just for depth purposes. But for the time being, Trendon Watford is going to play. Basically, he's going to play until he fouls out, I think, tonight. And he's at 3,400. You could even try Greg Brown at 3,200. And guys like Justice Winslow, Josh Hart, the salaries are a little higher, but I think they're still great values.
Garion, where do you sit here on a value play, dude?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting slate because there are so many value opportunities opened up because of injury, because of guys not playing, that I think, for as strange as it is to say that someone might go under the radar in the game that has by far the highest total of the slate, you look at Minnesota and there's no like glaring injury issue that would lead you to think someone's going to get expanded minutes or someone's going to have a huge role that they normally wouldn't have. But Jaden McDaniels' price point is still just very strange to me. He's $3,600. When you go back to January 27th, Jaden McDaniels is playing the 4th most minutes per game of any member of the Timberwolves, trailing the exact 3 guys you think he would be trailing. He's actually played more than 30 minutes in 4 of his past 5 games. Even though he's been sort of jumping back and forth between the starting lineup, going back to the bench, being the 6th man, it doesn't really affect his role at the end of the day. He still plays between 23 to 30 minutes seemingly every single night for the Timberwolves. And in what could be a very up-tempo, very high-scoring matchup against the Memphis Grizzlies, I just think you're looking at like a 6x, 7x floor with someone like McDaniels.
All right, to the sportsbook we go. Suns are the biggest favorites on the board tonight going up against the Thunder. Meanwhile, that game Garion just mentioned, Grizzlies and T-Wolves are the closest matchup. So are you targeting either of those games for a bet against the spread, or are you looking elsewhere, Garion?
I'll just bet Boston. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't really have all that much to do with the 28-2 thing. But they are an 8-point favorite here across their last 15 games. I know like a couple big blowouts, particularly this game against the Nets. Oh, it's 9 now. I'll still bet Boston. It's fine. They're outscoring opponents by 16.6 points per 100 possessions their last 15 games. Like, it's an absurd number. Their defense has been incredible, and it's been incredible against good teams. And right now, the Nets, like, they're missing all of their offensive firepower. The Nets, even just in general, have only covered 6 of their last 26 home games against the spread. I'm just going to take Boston blindly here. Even if it gets up to like 10, I don't care. I'll just bet the Celtics.
All right, Nick, where are you looking?
That's the game I have highlighted as well. And here goes Garion. I mean, the line's moving live as he's talking, up to -9. The Nets reeled off a couple wins before the break when they were shorthanded, and I feel like that built up like a little bit of unneeded goodwill. And of course, then they finish out their first half schedule by getting smacked around by the Washington Wizards, who are not a very good team. So honestly, I think this number could be a little bit higher. I mean, Garion laid out a pretty compelling case. Boston has been as hot as any team in the league, playing really, really well, really dating back to the last month and a half, 2 months. And Brooklyn's just really shorthanded. They just kind of need to limp through this period until at least one of Kevin Durant or Ben Simmons or Kyrie Irving, becomes a full-time player. But as of right now, I mean, this is going to be a Brooklyn team that's a shell of itself. I also kind of like OKC to cover a big number. They're +10 against Phoenix tonight. They do get SGA back. Josh Giddey played really well before the break, closed with 3 straight triple-doubles. And, of course, as we've talked about at length, no Chris Paul for the Suns. So I think Phoenix wins that game. I think long-term they're fine, but pretty big adjustment playing their first game all season without Chris Paul.
All right, Matt, take us home. What do you think?
So I've been talking about the Denver Nuggets as a dark horse finals contender, but that is entirely dependent on at least Jamal Murray coming back and then potentially Michael Porter Jr. coming back. As it stands, I think Denver is a pretty average team. Like, really what's happening with that analysis is I think Murray is just so much better than Bryn Forbes, Austin Rivers, the guys that are filling in for him. Murray's probably like a borderline all-star when he's at his best, but just the guys he would be replacing, I think, are well below average players. And those are the guys Denver has to give minutes to right now. So I really like the Kings on the other side of this game. I actually don't think there's a massive divide in total skill between these two teams. Like, yes, Jokic is the best player on the floor. It's not debatable. It's not close basically anytime Jokic is playing in a game. But the rest of the Denver Nuggets, I just think, fall off so fast. And Sacramento actually is a pretty deep team right now. I think they're pretty well balanced, and they traded Tyrese Halliburton, which I think I understand why people are critical of that. But for this season, if we're just talking about this year, I do think they got better with Domantas Sabonis. Jeremy Lamb, I think, is a decent player too. Davion Mitchell is returning from a hand injury for this game. The Kings are 4.5-point underdogs. I think this is much closer to a coin flip. So getting those points at home, I think, is really good value here.
All right, that Grizzlies-Timberwolves game has one of the highest totals of the season at a whopping 240. Gary, and it's not like the 244.5, whatever game that was last week we were talking about, but are you touching this one when it comes to betting a game total, or do you have your eye on another one?
Yeah, I'm once again definitely guaranteeing this game goes.
That was Hornets-Wolves, that's what it was. It was Hornets-Wolves last week.
Yeah, the Wolves play some high-scoring games. I'm going to go elsewhere. I'm going to go back to that Nuggets-Kings game. The Nuggets have kind of changed their identity. At least they were in the process of changing their identity before the All-Star break. It'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out tonight. But we think of the Nuggets as this plodding, slow-paced team because that's what they have tended to be the last 2.5 seasons. They were a top 10 pace team across their final 5 games. So I'm just sort of intrigued by that number. We know the Kings are a fast-paced team. They are also top 10. They're actually top 5 across their last 5 games. So if you've got 2 top 10 pace teams and 2 teams that aren't exactly like great defensive squads either going up against each other in this contest tonight, I think it probably goes over. I mean, the last 5 times these 2 teams have met, they've gone over the number. The Kings are 6-1 to the over in their last 7 games overall. So if the Nuggets are going to supply a little up-tempo pace here, I think this one goes over pretty easily.
Matt, do you think it goes over pretty easily?
I don't know. I mean, it's a high number.
You were a coward last week with 244.5, bud.
It covered by 1 point.
It doesn't matter. It covered.
In overtime.
In overtime, 1 point. I'm looking at an under on a different game. We got that news that Darius Garland and Karis LeVert are out for the Cavs, and the total only dropped from 210.5 to 208.5. To me, like, that should be a 5-point drop for those 2 players not being there, especially Garland. But the key is neither of those players is a good defender, Garland or LeVert. So taking them both off the court is going to make the Cavs offense worse, and it's also going to make the Pistons offense worse. I think it makes the game slower, especially if we get Cedi Osman playing point guard. Brandon Goodwin is probably the best defensive point guard on the Cavs. He should be in the rotation at this point. But Rondo, I think, has to slow the game down relative to what Garland and LeVert would have done. And Lauri Markkanen's also back, which you would say, yeah, Markkanen's a good offensive player. That probably helps the game go over. But I think the Cavs just have to play bigger lineups because of him. They have Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, Kevin Love, Lauri Markkanen, Dean Wade plays minutes in the front court, Isaac Okoro. Like, they're going to have 3 bigs essentially on the court at all times now. So even though Markkanen is a good offensive player, I think we just see a different dynamic with the team where they just only have 1 or 2 guards on the court at any given moment, and they're playing more big men, which is just going to mean a slower game. So I still like the under here, even though it's fallen to 208.5.
Nick, you like this whopping 240-point total here between the Grizz and Wolves? You want another one?
Well, I mean, as a matter of precedent, I have to go over on that one. But I'm going to turn my attention back to that Suns-Thunder game and kind of employ, the same logic that I talked about with the last question with OKC covering. I think this game goes under 218.5, and it's because I just think there's going to be a short-term adjustment period for Phoenix playing without Chris Paul. I mean, it's a massive, massive adjustment for especially how many minutes he was playing over the last few weeks. Like early in the season, the Suns were blowing everybody out. Chris Paul was playing like 28 to 30 minutes a lot of nights, not playing late into the fourth quarter. But, during this latest, I think, 8-game winning streak heading into the break, and even before that, he was routinely in the 35 to 40-minute range, which for Chris Paul is not something we've seen in recent years. So, that's just a ton of production to replace. We already talked about Campaign not being there. I think there's going to be some initial clunkiness with that Phoenix offense. And OKC, yeah, you get SGA back. That's great. Still the worst offense in the league coming out of the break, I should say. They are a top 10 defense. Obviously, the Suns, one of the best defenses in the league. OKC has gone under in 57% of its games this season. There's just a lot to me, I think, pointing toward the under on a number that's probably a couple points too high at 218.5.